Hello. This video is going to discuss China and the Northeast Asian theater. When I describe the Northeast Asian theater, what I'm talking about is the countries of Japan, South Korea, North Korea, and Taiwan, and how China interacts with all of those states in terms of security and the application of military power. What we should understand about Northeast Asia is that it is primarily a maritime theater for China, with the one exception of North Korea, which we'll discuss later on. Also, and differently to say the South China Sea, in Northeast Asia, China is surrounded by two very powerful US allies, South Korea and Japan. Their proximity to China, plus the fact that these states, while not as strong as China, certainly have the military capacity to hurt China, makes China treat them in a slightly different way than they do, for example, the Philippines or Vietnam in the South China Sea. And this creates some interesting deterrence dynamics. Also, we should always understand that strategy, or military and political strategy, on the one side, always has to compete with trade and economics on the other. So while you might describe significant tensions in Northeast Asia at times, it is very unusual, although not exceptional, to see the trade or economic links between Japan, South Korea, and China to be disrupted. There's perhaps one major exception, which is the THAAD crisis of 2016, when China used economic levers as a coercive tool to prevent South Korea, or to try to prevent South Korea from deploying a US missile defense system on its soil. The other thing you should notice is that there are significant flashpoints in Northeast Asia that all have to be managed and are all approached slightly differently from Beijing's perspective. So for China, the kind of geostrategic reality is that geography is against it in strategic terms. If this is China here, the geography of Taiwan, which is an enemy or an opposition state, and then a number of Japanese-controlled islands from between Taiwan and the main islands of Japan, up through Japan, and then from Japan, these islands up to the Kamchatka Peninsula with Russia, means that China does not have easy access to the Pacific Ocean. Indeed, for China, for example, to get its SSBNs to operate in the depths of the expanse of the Pacific makes it very difficult, as it has to pass through, essentially enemy or opposition controlled choke points. And this places extra pressure on its development in the South China Sea, as you'll see in a later video. The second point about geography here is that traditionally the sea has provided some stopping power for South Korea and Japan. However, China's pursuit of large numbers of precision-guided munitions means that China has the ability to strike targets in South Korea and Japan with some precision, and for example, thereby disabling Japanese and US warships operating out of ports in Japan. And this changes the strategic dynamics in the region, both for China, for South Korea, for Japan, and for the US. So while geography goes against China in many ways in this region, they are using technology to overcome some of those disadvantages. Also in Northeast Asia, and similarly to some extent in the South China Sea, what you see is kind of a circular dynamics where many different factors interact with each other. And these are just kind of a broad overview of what they are. So in Northeast Asia, particularly the legacies of history and nationalism connect to inform many of the political and strategic flashpoints. Particularly Japan's actions prior and during World War II in South Korea and in China feeds nationalistic impulses, which are then exploited by political elites in Beijing, but also in South Korea and to a lesser extent in Tokyo. Additionally, because it's a maritime theater, the introduction of the law of the sea and the tight geographic boundaries, which means delineating economic exclusive zones very difficult, means that maritime sovereignty or maritime territorial sovereignty has become an increasingly securitized or strategic issue, as has the role of resource and energy exploration from the sea. Connected to that is a substantial military buildup not only in China, but also in South Korea and Japan and North Korea and Taiwan. Multiple actors often operating in the same place, and the role of geostrategy. So you have a very complex mixture of factors which informs how China and other states interact with each other. And there are numerous flashpoints. In Northeast Asia, one of the most commonly talked about ones is between China and Japan. This is the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. These are a series or 3 small uninhabited islands that are currently owned by Japan but are also claimed by China. The waters around these islands have some economic potential, particularly in terms of oil and gas exploration and fishing, and are also of strategic value for both China and Japan. For China, they are strategic value because of their proximity to Taiwan, and also the fact that they would allow easier access into the Pacific. And for Japan, they are strategic value because of their proximity to Okinawa and the belief that if China grabs the Senkaku Islands, Okinawa's position would be increasingly vulnerable. This crisis has been semi-militarized. In 2012, Japan, for very complex political reasons, purchased the islands from a private owner. China viewed this as a disruption of the status quo and significantly increased its coercive pressure on Japan. This involved allowing or sending large numbers of Chinese fishing vessels into the waters around Senkaku Islands, often escorted by Chinese Coast Guard ships. And even today, what you have seen is regular incursions of Chinese Coast Guard ships and fishing vessels into the waters around Senkaku Islands. Sometimes into the territorial waters within 12 nautical miles, but more often than not in what Japan claims as the EEZ of the area. Japan normally responds with Coast Guard vessels of their own. Occasionally, China has deployed military vessels into this region. Notably, I think 2 years ago, a Chinese submarine surfaced within the EEZ or very close to the 12 nautical mile limit of the Senkaku Islands in a clear signal to Japan that China has the ability to do so. And in response, Japan has increased its military power in these islands here and here by deploying rapid response forces, going to deploy anti-ship missile batteries and surveillance systems on those islands to kind of deter China from trying to achieve a fait accompli. As of yet, and still, it is unlikely that you will see open conflict over these islands, but they are a significant flashpoint between Tokyo and Beijing. Now, between South Korea and China, the issues are slightly less tense, but often more deadly. There is one territorial or semi-territorial dispute. It is over the Socotra Rock, which is here. This is not an island, but a kind of protruding landmass out of the sea that is in South Korean claimed waters, but is also in Chinese claimed waters. In response, South Korea built a scientific platform on top of the rock, which you can see here, which is manned some of the year, and regularly send vessels around it to show China that these are South Korean claimed waters. And China does the same thing. This issue does not have the same level of tension that the Senkaku Islands do, for example, or that you see in the South China Sea, but nevertheless, it is something that has to be managed between China and South Korea. Of much more import is illegal Chinese fishing activity in South Korean waters. Because of the proximity between China and South Korea, neither side has managed to clearly delineate or decide where their EEZs stop. The distance is less than 400 nautical miles in places. There has been a fishing agreement which set up joint and separate fishing zones, but regularly Chinese fishing vessels aggressively fish illegally in South Korean waters. This is a picture here of Chinese fishing vessels linked together as they try and get past South Korean Coast Guard patrols. These incidents have led to the deaths of both South Korean Coast Guard officers and Chinese fishermen. And increasingly, or occasionally, what you have seen is a South Korean Coast Guard backed up by the South Korean military trying to protect these waters. China, because there's a fishing agreement, has made some efforts to rein this in, but nevertheless, it is a common and consistent problem at sea between the two countries. Next, you go to possibly the biggest flashpoint in the region, which is, of course, the island of Taiwan. Now, this is an extraordinarily complex issue, but if you break it down, Taiwan is claimed by China as one part of China, whereas Taiwan claims itself as an almost separate state. It is a democracy now, which China is very unimpressed with. And China has decided, or Xi Jinping has decided, that Taiwan will be unified with China within the next 50 years. From a military perspective, Taiwan is extremely vulnerable. Obviously, it is much smaller than China, and it is faced with significant numbers of aircraft, missile batteries, and the like focused all on Taiwan. Taiwan used to gain some protection. They would place most of their military systems on this side of the island, but as China's military has gained in strength, for example, getting aircraft carrier, longer range naval vessels, longer range aircraft, China has frequently sailed around this side of Taiwan, threatening these previously protected installations. There is a significant debate whether China has the ability to invade Taiwan using military means. Some, particularly in the US, argue that China is well able to do this now, particularly given its increased military capacity. Others say that still, Taiwan, because of the water and the difficulties of amphibious landings, and particularly potential landing zones on Taiwan, would make it very, very difficult for China to successfully invade Taiwan, especially if the US became involved. However, most experts agree that the Taiwan issue is one of the key areas in East Asia where significant conflict could break out in the future. And then obviously the last issue in Northeast Asia for China is North Korea. Now this is an estranged relationship between Pyongyang and Beijing. For China, North Korea is potentially dangerous. It always should be noted that North Korea's nuclear weapons not only target Seoul and Japan and potentially the US, but could also be turned on Beijing if required. And very often, China or North Korea can be a political burden for China. While both are communist countries, North Korea does not trust China. North Korea is very well aware that it is dependent on China and that China holds the levers of power. And this makes the relationship quite complex sometimes. There is some debate whether China would like a nuclear North Korea or does not like a nuclear North Korea. In my view, China does not like a nuclear North Korea, but North Korea is not willing to listen to China about disarmament at this stage. But we should also be aware that for China, North Korea is extremely strategically useful. Not only does it distract the US to some extent, but also it is a buffer zone between South Korea and the US forces in South Korea and the Chinese border. So if North Korea collapsed, for example, there is significant debate what China's reaction would be. Would they send in their own troops to create or maintain some sort of buffer between the US and South Korean forces and the Chinese border? Or would they, allow the US and South Korean forces to race up to that border? We just don't know. But this is a question that is outstanding. We should also acknowledge that while it has been a political burden, China has often been criticized, for example, for not doing enough to rein in North Korea's nuclear program. It has provided Beijing with some regional leverage, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, where Beijing played a key role in disarmament negotiations. However, more recently, because South Korea and the US has engaged directly with Pyongyang, China has to some extent been marginalized. It should also be noted that China has been regularly accused of violating or looking the other way in terms of UN sanctions. This is particularly true with at-sea transfers of energy and cross-border trade. So that the cumulative evidence of China's relationship with North Korea is that while it is a difficult thing to manage, China is quite interested in ensuring that North Korea remains stable and is not going to break into a state of collapse, which could increase strategic tensions in the region and make Beijing's life even more difficult than it already is. So how do we sum up Northeast Asia and China? China's military development, in combination with other factors such as North Korea, is leading to extraordinarily heightened military spending across the region. Both South Korea and Japan are investing significant sums in missile capabilities, modern submarines, fifth-generation aircraft carriers, which both South Korea and Japan are pursuing, as is China, as you know, and in other new domains such as cyber. This has led to a question, will this lead to arms racing? Well, what we're seeing is arms competition in very specific areas, but not open arms racing, as no side is actually seeing massive increases in military spending, rather focusing on specific areas for military buildup, which is a different definition. We will likely continue to see long-term competition in the military and strategic realm in Northeast Asia. But also, all these countries need each other, and cooperation will, in economic terms, will likely be maintained. Although there are some indications that both Japan and South Korea, as a result of the COVID crisis, are seeking to reduce their reliance, particularly on the Chinese market and Chinese manufacturing. So watch the space in terms of how this is going. We will also probably likely see maintained Chinese coercive activities, particularly in terms of sending fishing vessels, Coast Guard vessels, and occasionally naval vessels in the areas around Senkaku Islands, and potentially even in future contested areas between South Korea and China. And the big question is, what is the risk of escalation in any of the flashpoints we have mentioned? Most experts agree that the issues between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands, or between China and South Korea in terms of fishing, is unlikely to lead to significant escalation or the outbreak of conflict or war. However, there are greater escalation risks in terms of what goes on with Taiwan, particularly how the world views Taiwan, and if China feels that Taiwan is becoming a recognized international state or not. And we see this again in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, where Taiwan has gained significant international plaudits for its actions in combating the virus, and China has shown that it is willing to use economic tools to punish states who are seeking to recognize Taiwan's actions, particularly Australia. And of course, North Korea is just an unstable actor in the region, and experts disagree on if a North Korea collapse scenario happens, the risk of escalation into conflict between China and the US or actors on the Korean Peninsula. So Northeast Asia is a strange strategic area for China. It is a geographic burden in terms of geostrategy, how it links to the Pacific. It is a militarized and increasingly militarized area, yet it is also an area defined by economic cooperation. Nevertheless, for Europe, we have to understand that Northeast Asia now is has strong military powers, is one of the economic centers of the world, and therefore cannot be ignored.